quick message before we start. We hope our conversations open up new perspectives and new ideas for our listeners, and our goal is to be informative. But we want to emphasize that this isn't a substitute for individual therapy, and we're not providing medical or psychological advice here. If you feel moved by what you hear, and if you want to explore it more deeply, or if there's something in your life you'd like to work on, please reach out to an LGBTQ affirming therapist online or in your area. You'll be glad you did.
Welcome to the Psych Out Podcast, where two psychology nerds get psyched up for LGBTQ affirming history, research, and practice. And now your hosts, Chris and Jen.
Welcome, everybody, to the Psych Out Podcast. I'm Chris, and with me, as always, is my friend and co-host, Dr. Jen.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Jen. I'm a clinical psychologist in private practice who works mostly with LGBTQ clients. I should really just put that in some kind of melody at this point and just sing it. All right. And Chris, I have a question for you. Yeah. I want to know if you have ever seen the anger iceberg. Dun, 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 dun.
I have. That's shown up on...
Yes. Could you describe this?
It is most often spotted in PowerPoints or Google slide decks.
Yes.
I would say twice, perhaps as many as 4 times in my education thus far. Iceberg, small part of the iceberg on the top above the water labeled with anger. And then below in the rest of the image, you have, a lot of other negative emotions, negative valence emotions. You have sadness, grief, helplessness. What else? Fear. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, I have seen this used in groups where the person leading the group has a binder full of handouts, and that's the one that they pulled that day. Right. And by which I mean, I think it's often used very thoughtlessly. Right.
Yeah.
What is the anger iceberg attempting to communicate? What is the point of the anger iceberg?
Broadly, it seems to be communicating the idea that there's always something beneath anger that is perhaps more important to address or that needs to be addressed. That the anger should go away, or that it naturally would go away. It always seems to be minimizing the anger and
100%.
It's almost oversimplifying by attempting to complicate.
Well put. And it's visually minimizing anger, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I remember when I was getting trained in a particular kind of therapy that I do, the person training me, we were talking about the concept of primary and secondary emotions. And primary and secondary emotions really mean the emotion that you initially have in response to a stimulus, and then the next emotion that happens in the chain, right? That either that comes as a result of the way you interpret the previous emotion. So you get in a car accident, you're really frightened, and that's the first emotion. And then you interpret your body's activation and your heart racing and the whole in the ringing in your ears and whatever, and you get angry instead of afraid, right? So the primary emotion would be fear and the secondary emotion would be anger. And the person training me said, oh, well, anger is always a secondary emotion.
Yeah, I had that same. It was almost it was like a saying. It was communicated to me in a different context and much more as a standalone thought, not as part of looking at a behavior chain or something like that.
Yeah. And not to be too precious about it, but that pissed me off. That made me angry. What? And at the time, I don't think I had really identified what it was, but I knew that some of it was about marginalized experiences.
Right.
Was about hey, straight, cis, white lady. It's one thing for you to say that anger is a secondary emotion.
Yeah.
And I don't want to minimize misogyny, but it's one thing for you to say that that is the case. And it's another thing for me to say that somebody, for instance, I'll have an example. I had a coworker who just like flat out was like, so how do you have sex exactly? I'm like, I don't know that there is another initial response to that makes more sense than anger.
Yeah. Yeah. And like,
right?
Like, is it going to be helpful to you to like look at that anger and analyze it and then like address, something underneath that? Probably not.
Yeah, like maybe I was really afraid. Maybe I was really sad. Like, no, it was just pissed off.
Yeah.
Right. The other issue that I have with this whole anger is always a secondary emotion is that we're very vague when we talk about primary and secondary emotions. Like I explained it as like things that happen in time, right? Mm-hmm. Primary happens first and secondary happens second. But a lot of the times I think therapists, and that anger iceberg like reflects this, treat primary emotions as the important ones and secondary emotions as the less important ones, the ones that just like paint over the primary emotions, right?
Yeah. And because it's such vague language, I think it can also stand in for other like ideological assumptions. Like there can be an implicit idea that like, you're aware of your anger, but that there are unconscious emotions that need to be brought forward by a therapist.
Right.
That can have a very psychodynamic gloss to it. That's very like prescriptive therapist telling you what you're feeling, even though you may not be aware of it.
That really makes me think too, it's a little bit like if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? If you see yourself as like a therapist or even like a friend, and your job is to like, how to like notice what someone's like feeling underneath and bring that up to their awareness, then like, of course, in your mind, it's going to be like, well, that's how you deal with the situation is you really pay attention to the fact that you're frightened or that you're sad or whatever. And, I will say, as someone who spent many, many years doing activism, I call bullshit on that.
Yeah.
I call bullshit on that. Sometimes it doesn't matter if my anger is flowing out of fear or sadness. I need the friggin' anger.
Yeah.
And the anger is what's going to activate me in ways that are actually effective for what my needs are. And like, I think that's the other reason why I see it as coming from this like sort of privileged perspective. That is like, well, I guess you've never had to be in a situation where you needed to get good and mad in order to fight the system.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's an element there can be an element of policing there. It's like, we know that it's uncomfortable often for ourselves to be angry. It can be very uncomfortable to witness other people be angry. And then when you're compounding that with, structural racism and bigotry and, people having reactions to other marginalized communities, public displays of emotions, like, it pays to be very critical of like, okay, what am I telling this group of people they should do with their emotions? What am I telling this like individual who's a part of this group that they should do with their emotions? I should really question that.
Yeah, exactly. Oh my gosh, you also make another good point about the way that we treat anger, which is just like, it's icky. It makes us uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I don't like it. I don't like anger, which is a very culturally specific, I would say, perspective as well.
Yeah,
absolutely. So, okay, all of this is an intro to say, like, we're going to use a case example from queer history, and we're going to talk first about the benefits of anger. Why is anger useful? When do we actually lean into anger, even if it is a secondary emotion? When do we take that anger iceberg handout and rip it up and throw it over our shoulders, right?
Yeah. If it makes us feel icky, what is the moment where we hold that icky feeling and push forward with the anger?
Exactly. And then like the other side of that is, okay, how do we do that in such a way that we don't become burned out? Because I think anger burns bright but quick.
Yeah.
Right. And now that I've sort of like metaphorically torn apart this anger iceberg handout, the truth is also that if we live only in anger and we don't pay attention to any of the other emotions, a lot of times those emotions will catch up with us, which we will get to in the second half or second of 3, I don't know yet, of our of our episodes on this.
We're going to explore this over a couple episodes, and our goal here with the first one is to focus on, what can anger achieve? What can it do for us? What is the benefit of holding on to it when there are so many different reasons and so many different forces like trying to suppress anger?
So the case example that we're going to use to talk about this is a really important organization in queer history that I think second only to maybe the Stonewall Uprising is like a paradigmatic, like activist moment on behalf of queer people. And that is the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, or ACT UP, which began in 1987 in New York City. And in fact, ACT UP New York is kind of the most well-known of the organizations that eventually branched out all over the country. And it was founded in 1987, which is a time where the AIDS crisis had been sort of well known for, most of the decade of the 80s. And there was no effective treatment for AIDS. AIDS was considered a death sentence at that point. And what happened was for a week or so, there were these posters that were just showing up all over New York City. There was this big black background with a pink triangle, like a bright pink triangle, and the slogan, "Silence equals death." And describing this, I bet at least people of a certain age out there listening to this are visualizing it, knowing what I'm talking about. This is one of the most iconic, queer images, maybe second only to the pride flag, really.
Yeah. I'd say it was probably the second image I was aware of.
Yeah.
As far as this imagery stands for queer liberation, queer rights, for queerness, and organized discussions of that.
Yes. And what a lot of people don't know, because it ended up getting sort of reproduced on posters, on T-shirts, like there's iconic images of ACT UP protests where everybody's wearing these T-shirts. It's very 1980s. They're all very buttoned up, jeans and T-shirts. But underneath that was text that included turn anger, fear, grief into action. Mm-hmm. And this was actually created by a collective that was not ACT UP, but right around that time, a week after these posters started to circulate in New York City, there was a big meeting at the Gay Men's Health Crisis or something, I can't remember, GMHC organization about the AIDS crisis that kind of got energy came out of the woodworks when this poster sort of blasted itself onto the scene.
Yeah, things are bubbling up.
And actually the people who created the poster, I have a great book that I'll recommend from Avram Finkelstein, who was one of the people who helped create it, were actually trying to they were going to create riots. That was their goal, was to they were going to have a 3-poster series that would result in riots. Heck yeah. So everybody gathered, and it was at that gathering in 1987 that sort of happened organically that ACT UP was born. And ACT UP, most well known, Chris, why don't you talk about when were you exposed to ACT UP and what did you see about them when you were growing up?
I think I was first exposed to them in the context of progressive activism around the Iraq War. That was my introduction to political activism, and there were organizers and commentators and journalists that I was following who were really identifying this as a moment where activism was finally catching popular attention again after it really sort of had laid fallow, and they were highlighting here are some other moments in recent history that you may not be aware of where activism in the streets, mass protest, has achieved political goals. And ACT UP was, in certain parts of those circles, the touchstone of here's what we want to be doing, or here's how we can have some hope that, actually taking to the streets is valuable, even if we can't, out of whole cloth replicate the sort of mass, marches, sustain large number of marches.
Absolutely. And that's such an interesting comparison, because I think the emotional landscape that went into ACT UP was so different.
Yeah, wildly
what was going on in terms, wildly different. Okay, so every Monday thereafter, when ACT UP would gather to plan civil disobedience actions, and I don't want to get too deeply into it, but when I say ACT UP gathered to plan, that's a little bit of misleading. ACT UP didn't have like a stable leadership or like, committee of like board of directors or whatever. It was actually a bunch of loosely affiliated affinity groups who would come up with their own ideas and then go to the group. And the group would either endorse and participate in those activities, or the affinity group would go do their own thing.
A lot of the affinity groups were involved in doing sort of video journalism, video activism. There were 3 or 4 of those that I did some research on to give another example of like what an affinity group was in this context.
Yeah. There were also groups that specifically directed ACT UP in doing activism around women's issues, around the issues of people of color, especially like Haitian immigrants, needle exchanges. Like there's sort of a stereotype that ACT UP was by and for white gay men, and that's not accurate. And it comes from us wanting to see ACT UP as being an organization with a stable leadership.
Yeah.
But so every Monday thereafter, for many years, people would meet at the same clinic, and they would all say together, ACT UP is a diverse, nonpartisan group of individuals united in anger and committed to direct action to end the AIDS crisis. And, there's a great book that is half memoir and half research by Deborah Gould, who was a participant in ACT UP. Who said, there's something about united in anger that is both like true and not true, right? Because it was like anger that really brought people together. Like during the first 5 or 6 years of the crisis, people were just either in shock or fear or grief or whatever, but there was something about the shame. Yes. There was something about the bubbling up of anger that like, this is an example of where like anger is an activating emotion. Shame doesn't make you go and fight on the streets. Right.
Yeah.
So there was something about that bubbling up of anger that brought people together and made people like able to work past whatever their differences were to go out there and like combat a common enemy, which was either AIDS or like the FDA or whoever, right?
Yeah.
The CDC. But also united in anger makes the assumption that because we're all angry, we're all united.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
That in and of itself is enough.
Yes, that in and of itself is enough. And like, as we'll see sort of in the second half of our conversation, it wasn't. Mm-hmm. Not for long.
Yeah.
Right?
If you like what you're hearing and you'd like to support us, please visit our Patreon. There, for as little as $5, you can help keep the Psych Out podcast going.
But at the beginning and for, years after, that saying was said at the beginning of ACT UP meetings and really helped carry people into the streets. And ACT UP had a lot of like, quote, wins, right? What are some of the things that ACT UP accomplished, Chris?
So the first one that gets talked about a lot is accelerating, pressuring the FDA into fast tracking approvals for drugs. There were experimental drugs that activists were, they're meeting in the streets and using their anger that way. Some people are just using their anger to teach themselves from the ground up how to read medical reports, how to read studies, and doing this research to say, okay, what's out there that could possibly help? And then once they were able to identify things like that, they realized, okay, this exists. It's in a lab somewhere. It's going to be buried behind years and years of red tape. And nobody I know has years and years to wait for this drug.
Right. So you have people people on the outside of the FDA building, staging die-ins and chanting and I don't think this was the FDA action, but other ones where they actually invade and lock arms and have to be dragged away. You have just a very classic civil disobedience images, people sort of climbing up on the building and putting banners up that say silence equals death. And at the same time, you have these really educated people who were cool. Now that we've spurred you into action or annoyed you into submission, listen to us because we know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
They had both, for sure.
Educated, but often non-expert, and often having to use that anger to get a foot in the door to even be listened to, because they didn't have credentials or standing in academic or professional communities.
Yeah. And I will say, as someone who went through cancer treatment, there is an assumption now that a patient or former patient is going to be part of whatever group is making decisions about, say, who's allowed in clinical trials or what drug is going to be put in a clinical trial and how. And that came from ACT UP.
Yeah.
From the idea that essentially nothing, I'm borrowing this from disability advocacy, but nothing about us without us, that they should be included in those decisions. So another success that they had that was hard won was the CDC expanding its definition of AIDS to include the presentation that was normally seen in women. Because HIV is the infection with the virus, and AIDS is when that infection with the virus starts to manifest in various illnesses. And at the time, the illnesses were all ones that were likely to show up in men versus illnesses that a woman might start having because of a reduced immune system, like really bad yeast infections or bladder and kidney infections and things that were more likely to show up in female bodies. Right. And
so changing that definition had an effect on ability to access care, ability to.
Yeah, if you were not designated as having AIDS, you didn't qualify for a lot of housing support or medication support, or it was really life or death, right?
Yeah.
And I will say, I note that I'm doing a lot of generalizing about gender labels, and that is in part because I think I'm so immersed in ACT UP literature that I'm speaking the way that they did. But I want to acknowledge that. Anyway, that was a success too, that they were able to force that change. From the very beginning, they actually had I don't think they would have used the term intersectional at the time. I don't think the term was kind of coined at the same time. But they had very intersectional approaches from the very beginning. So they had a lot of successes. And let's talk about why do we think, what was the role of anger in making their work successful, right? What is the value of anger when you are faced with massive injustice? And actually, to back up, in case I always forget, I'm actually older than the median population now, so I shouldn't assume that people listening to my words remember the things I remember. So by 1987, right, AIDS had been in the public consciousness for 5 or 6 years. Reagan had never said the word AIDS, right? It was underfunded. It was not being paid attention to. There were politicians who were using it as a tool to turn against the gay community. There were absolutely outrageous and scary suggestions to quarantine people with AIDS, to tattoo people with AIDS. That's the anger was not just, I'm scared that I'm going to die. It was you fuckers are going to start another Holocaust.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's partially where the pink triangle comes from, right? Not everybody knows the pink triangle was the gay equivalent of the yellow star in concentration camps. It was a symbol that was put on the uniforms of gay men. And how ACT UP used Holocaust imagery is a whole other conversation. But so that's the anger was from not just the existence of this illness. It's not just from the red tape, but from the clear prejudice that was fueling some of the red tape.
Yeah.
It's not just that our healthcare system sucks, although it was that too. And in fact, they were kind of some of the earliest healthcare for all, healthcare is a human right.
Yeah.
Groups. But it wasn't even just, it was also we know that the government is killing us through indifference.
Yeah. And not only indifference. I mean,
That's true. That's true. Yeah.
Jesse Helms, comes up 5 or 6 times in this reading. Yeah. And I remember a specific bit of legislation where the conservative evangelical Christian Jesse Helms in Congress sponsored legislation that banned any federal dollars for needle exchanges.
Oh, yeah.
So just as people are starting to come up with the idea of, hey, a way we can combat this drug that spreads through needle sharing is to do needle exchanges, like here Jesse Helms is in Congress riling up people and saying, we should never, like, tax dollars should never go for that.
Right.
That program should not exist. Not only, it's not even, oh, we need more time to study that.
Right.
Just as a moral position, that's not going to ever be paid for by the average taxpayer.
And, another thing, before Guantanamo Bay was being used to indefinitely lock up people that we accused of terrorism, it was being used to lock up Haitian refugees who were HIV positive.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, there was a lot of like, these populations were not well liked in the general public or on Capitol Hill. And there was active animosity that was also behind this. So when somebody is encountering me or my community or people I care about with active animosity, what is my primary emotion? You'd better friggin' bet it's anger.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk about anger. Sometimes we talk about like the action urge of emotions, like what emotions make us want to do, right? What emotions sort of on like a deep visceral level motivate us to do. So like, yeah. What does shame tend to motivate people to do?
I mean, it makes me want to pull inward, makes me want to hide a little bit. I'm probably going out less, like just physically. The idea of going out in the street and be around a lot of people and being visible is kind of antithetical to how I feel when I'm shamed.
Yeah. What about sadness?
Feels slow, feels like I'm just being very cautious with everything I do, because if I do the wrong thing, I might become more sad, and I don't want to experience that. It's slowing things down, and anger feels a lot faster to me.
There's not a lot of unleashing power that comes with shame or grief. Right. And fear, we do have fight in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, but we also have flight, freeze, or fawn. Mm-hmm. So fear also very rarely is unleashing power, right? So anger is activating. Anger makes us want to lash out for better or for worse. My story about that I like to use for like when anger is maybe justified, but maybe we shouldn't act on it. I had a roommate once, my wife and I, we had a roommate who we shared the kitchen with and we shared the refrigerator with, and we had a really small freezer. And this roommate bought a turkey the day after Thanksgiving, like a big old turkey that took up at least a half of the freezer. And we were like, oh, do you have like a Thanksgiving that you're going to do? Like an Echo Thanksgiving or a Friendsgiving? Oh, yeah, sure. I'll use it soon. Oh, I was just going to cook it later to have some meat. And like for a year kept saying that until the next Thanksgiving came around. And wouldn't you know it, he used that turkey for the next Thanksgiving. I did not eat any of that. But I remember seeing the turkey after like the third time he said he was going to get rid of it being in the freezer and like standing there for a second and fantasizing in my mind about taking that turkey and putting it on his pillow and letting it defrost. So like, that's a kind of unleashing power that maybe wasn't directed in an effective way, right? But when I participated, say, in activism, like I remember when I did activism at the city level for a while. And there was a landlord who was kicking out a bunch of low-income people in order to upgrade, to tear down their apartments and upgrade them and sell like luxury condos. And they were like playing fast and loose with city ordinances, right? About it. And I remember like being on the street corner with everybody, like absolutely infuriated at what was being done to our community. And united in anger, right? Yeah. Like I wasn't there in fear because I wasn't losing my housing, but you'd better bet that I was friggin' pissed off and I was standing on the street corner with other pissed off people. And we did enough picketing and made that landlord look bad enough that in fact they stopped their plans, right? So anger is activating for good or for ill, right? And it takes thought to have it be effective, but that doesn't mean it's never effective. That doesn't mean it's bad, everybody.
Right.
Anger can be good.
Yeah. And we spend so much time like bottling it up and not wanting it to be visible. And especially if we're in a marginalized population where the dominant discourse really expects us to be docile and, be well behaved. I think there's often this struggle within ourselves to say like, well, if I act angry, it's going to be counterproductive. And to a lot of my reading of ACT UP, they found the opposite to be true, that at moments where they were most visibly got their anger out in front of cameras, it really changed how they saw themselves being perceived by the public and how they saw themselves being portrayed in the media.
Yeah, there's a lot of quotes that I read about like people didn't see us as victims anymore.
Yeah.
They didn't see us as like tragic stories. They saw us as people possibly even to be afraid of.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which, if you think about like the stereotype about gay people at the time, or about drug users at the time, which is like tragic victims who are like feeble and probably going to die at any minute, right? This was a very, very different image.
Yeah.
That they were putting. Absolutely. There was like a very conscious effort to harness anger to show people the full dimension of being somebody as a part of a marginalized group and also somebody with an illness.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm going to read a couple quotes, and these are going to sort of transition us to the flip side of our conversation, which is when anger becomes compulsory, it tends to be problematic. A lot of people know Larry Kramer. Actually, if you know anybody associated with ACT UP, you probably know Larry Kramer. Not the end-all be-all of ACT UP and not the sole founder or the leader of ACT UP, although a lot of people identify him that way. Kind of a curmudgeon for good or ill.
Yeah.
And a lot of people in ACT UP loved him and some people in ACT UP really didn't.
But very easy to find any given clip of him being very angry. So when we talk about, him serving as a face of ACT UP in some narratives, like that face is an angry one.
It is. I mean, it is really like one of the two main documentaries about AIDS, which is not the one that I would actually recommend, but it's called How to Survive a Plague. And it starts out with Larry Kramer like yelling at a bunch of people. And like, I have to say, like, in such a captivating way, like angry Larry Kramer is like amazing. But here's something that he wrote in 1991. So like ACT UP New York by about 91 and 92, we're going to talk more about this next time, was really starting to fray at the edges. A lot of people were starting to drop out and also a lot of people were dying. Right. And in 91, Larry Kramer published an essay. And here's a quote from it. "I look at faces at countless memorial services and cannot comprehend why the connection isn't made between these deaths and going out to fight so that more of these deaths, including possibly one's own, can be staved off. Huge numbers regularly show up in cities for candlelight marches, all duly recorded for the television cameras. Where are these same numbers when it comes to joining political organizations or plugging into the incipient civil disobedience movement represented in ACT UP?" And you can hear how in this quote, he's placing memorializing and mourning as in opposition to political organizing and civil disobedience.
Yeah.
Right. And, in Gould's book, she really documents in quite a bit of detail how anger became like compulsory. It became like, if I deviate away from anger, then maybe if I'm not HIV positive, I'm betraying HIV positive people, right?
Right. I'm betraying the movement. I'm betraying the actions that have been taken thus far, what's been built up to now.
Right. If I'm deviating away from anger and I am an HIV positive person, then maybe I'm just like conceding to this victim narrative that I have worked so hard to fight against, right? And then another quote that I'm going to read that I think like really gets to like this inflection point that we're talking about between anger and other emotions and being in an organization that harnesses anger effectively, but then mandates anger. And I can't pronounce this person's name. David Wojnarowicz, I think. Yeah, in a book called Close to the Knives. And this is actually also quoted in a documentary called United in Anger. Haha, United in Anger, which is the one that I would recommend if you want to watch a documentary about ACT UP. And it's a little long, so bear with me. There is a tendency for people affected by this epidemic to police each other or prescribe what the most important gestures would be for dealing with this experience of loss. I resent that. So let me pause. He's noticing that this is happening in ACT UP at this point, right? And then he says, at the same time, I worry that friends will slowly become professional pallbearers, right? Backing up. This is a time when people were attending like a dozen funerals a month.
Yeah.
Right? When like they were losing literally 100 friends in a year, right? I worry that friends will slowly become professional pallbearers, waiting for each death of their lovers, friends, and neighbors, and polishing their funeral speeches, perfecting their rituals of death rather than a relatively simple ritual of life, such as screaming in the streets. I worry because the urgency of the situation, because of seeing death coming in from the edges of abstraction, where those with the luxury of time have cast it. I imagine what it would be like if friends had a demonstration each time a lover or a friend or a stranger died of AIDS. I imagine what it would be like if each time a lover, friend, or stranger died of this disease, their friends, lovers, or neighbors would take the dead body and drive with it in a car 100 miles an hour to Washington, D.C. and blast through the gates of the White House and come to a screeching halt before the entrance and dump their lifeless form on the front steps. This image of mourning and anger all tangled up with each other. Right? And I think we're going to get to that a little bit next time. I do want to make a comment that reading this, and I would never want to compare one mass death to another, like mass tragedy, or like one historical era of retrenchment to another too directly. But I also wonder if right now we are all being caught up in despair at the abstract losses that we're experiencing, not necessarily deaths, although some people, but like the loss of the progress we felt that we made toward our rights and toward our safety. Yeah. And how easy it is for us to get pulled into despair, and how we also need to figure out how to harness our anger in order to take action.
Yeah.
And ACT UP, I think, is a really good model for that. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm really excited for the second half, or second of three, I don't know yet, of this. I think Chris and I have been researching this and really immersed in it for a long time, and it's exciting to share with you. So I look forward, Chris, to talking about this next time and like flipping the coin.
Yeah, absolutely. Taking all this research that we've been doing for, how many months has it been now?
I don't know, 6?
Yeah, it's been a while, and it's exciting to lay this out in a structure that's shareable and that gives us some stories to tell, some quotes to examine, and some history to look at and learn from.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And we will return shortly with the second part of this series.
You've been listening to the Psych Out Podcast. For more information on today's subject, or to find our Patreon, check the links below. Join us next time to learn more about the psychology of who we are.
These are difficult times. We know that some of you out there are suffering so much that you might be thinking of ending your life. If you're having thoughts of suicide, please reach out to professionals for help. You can go to an emergency room, call 911, or reach out to the hotlines we have linked in this description below. I know that many of us have had bad experiences in medical settings, but there are people, many people in this field who want you to live. Please reach out for help so that you can find them. We want you around for our next talk.